Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Joe Fish Kay. I'm Principal Research Scientist in Emerging Technologies, and it is my pleasure today to introduce Wendy Ju. I think this is a particularly interesting talk for Mozilla for two reasons. One of them is the work that Wendy has been doing around cross-cultural stuff. What I love about the discussion around cross-cultural attitudes to things about like driving came to the forefront for me. I was doing an ethno breakfast, which is a meeting of people interested in ethnography, at Nissan about 8 or 10 years ago, because they're doing all this smart self-driving car stuff over in Sunnyvale. And one of the things that came out of this discussion was that in the future, a standard way that you will hack your car is that you will change your settings to drive like you're a Parisian, but in Palo Alto, right? Which would be great because you could get everywhere a lot faster, you could fit into a lot smaller parking places, and you'd piss a lot of people off. That observation that driving behaviors are not just standard, but are sort of cultural artifacts, I thought was really interesting, and I'm really excited to see the stuff that Wendy's done digging into that. And I think it's that particular combination of the cross-cultural and the data that's really interesting for Mozilla. This is something we struggle with. Our relationship to data in this company is problematic and difficult and interesting. And our relationship to cross-cultural issues, I think in many ways we have a better handle on it than how we think about data. But I'm really excited to have this as a way to think through those issues. So that's why I'm really excited about it. I'm also delighted to introduce Wendy Ju. She's a professor at Cornell Tech, and prior to that ran the Center for Design Research at Stanford for a while. We've supported her work through the Mozilla research grants. And she continues to be a long-time collaborator and friend. So I'm very happy. Oh, I'll tell you one more thing. I actually married Wendy to her husband. And we shared an office in grad school, so she has dreadful stories about 21-year-old me, available probably for the price of, a drink or two. And I can't believe I just let that go. Okay. All right, Wendy, over to you. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Joe Fish. So this talk has this title that Joe Fish helped influence, which is, where the F did this autonomous car learn to drive? And what I'm hoping to address through autonomous driving is less about autonomous driving, but more about how we try to understand what the cross-cultural differences are in design, and actually why cross-cultural differences are really important to understanding how to design interaction with automation. So the focus of my overall research agenda is to understand how we should interact with systems as they become increasingly autonomous. I think people think of this as the evil robot problem, but it can be as simple as how you know whether your operating system is secretly doing updates, that you don't know about. One of the things that is pointed out by David Mindell in this book in particular is that a lot of people think that when you have autonomy, you no longer have to worry about human interaction with machines. And actually, it's surprisingly the case that you actually have to worry about it more. I mean, it's on some level obvious, like all the people around us are autonomous beings, and we have to spend a lot of time thinking about how we interact with them. But we've been spending most of our lives kind of developing the mores and norms and patterns that we use to interact with other people, and thinking about how to apply those to how we design machines so they can actually work as smoothly is really important. I'm going to show a couple works at the beginning just to show kind of the range of things that are going on in my research lab with the interaction with robots, different kinds of robots, and autonomous cars. And I hope that the sound goes through.
Right behind you. Don't come any closer. Oh, look at that. Don't come any closer. No closer. Okay. We don't have any garbage.
you okay? Are you okay? This is over here. Here you go.
So what you're seeing here is actually a hybrid between more traditional like ethnographic methods and design methods where we're actually prototyping different things in the future. Because we're trying to design interaction, you can't just make something and have it be because you don't really know how people are going to respond. And since the design is really dependent on this contingent behavior, we do these things where we stage designs, you know, in the real world, and then we actually look at the way people respond. We usually have a human in the loop so that the robot doesn't just fail upon the first foray, and then we actually then post-analyze the interaction to see what worked and didn't. So for example, one of the things that was really fascinating about this work, looking at how people interact with a robotic trash barrel, is the fact that a lot of people basically treat the trash barrel like it's a small animal. The most extreme example, and the one thing we really focused on, was when that child was trying to bait the trash barrel across the room where he wanted to go by like waving trash in front of it and like moving it along. So in the late 90s, when Byron Reeves and Cliff Nass were talking about how people treat machines like they're other people, a lot of people assume that that's because it's a soft-mindedness or stupidity, that people don't really understand how computers work. And it needs to be made clear that it's not actually some sort of sentient being on the other side. When you look at this work with the trash barrel, I mean, everyone knows how trash barrels work. It's obviously not a biological system. It's obviously not literally eating or digesting things. And yet almost everyone that's interacting with the robot treats it like it eats trash, and therefore is motivated by this like need to eat trash. And so we could do a lot to fight that. We've talked to roboticists who feel like you should put arms and eyes and different things to make it seem like it has high agency. But I actually think like figuring out what the metaphors people are just going to innately go to are, and working with that is kind of the easier, nicer thing to do as a designer. So we use some high technology techniques, but a lot of times we're using whatever low technology techniques we can to understand how these future interactions are going to work. And so in this next bit, I'm going to show some prototyping of how people outside of autonomous cars will interact with autonomous cars. And you can see here that we just use a costume to look at that. So this work it opened up this kind of question of how can we actually test how people outside the autonomous car will interact with autonomous cars. So we've talked to a lot of people in the automotive industry, and they have been concerned about how people outside the cars will feel about the interactions, but they've had difficulty figuring out what is the right way to study that. For example, if you worked for Google X, now Waymo, It's hard to have a team of people go and interview people, everywhere, and everywhere the car goes, because it's like a long linear path, and that's difficult to do. On the other hand, companies like Ford have done things like basically had VR. People wear VR helmets and they can see autonomous car coming, and it's like hard to know whether that is like anything like actually encountering a car. So coming up with just like, let's put a person in a car seat costume and like figure out an intersection where we can just like continuously watch the interactions, like that's a good way to look at how the interactions happen, and also to try out different things to help design things to help people understand what's going on better. So, for example, there was a lot of patents filed by like Audi and VW to do things like shine a crosswalk, or like have like displays that have green lights and red lights, on the car. But once you actually try those kinds of things in the field, it becomes obvious it's super dangerous to tell people to go when the car really only knows what it's going to do, not what the car behind it is going to do, or some oncoming. So the car really shouldn't be telling anyone what to do. In situ, that's obvious, but in the VR environment, when you control everything, it's not clear. The other thing that's interesting is that people are deciding whether they're going to go or not go when the car is pretty far away. And so it's actually farther than when people can actually see any sort of display on the car. What people are actually doing is looking at the motion of the car, and people who are driving a car tend to hit the brakes just a little if they see someone's coming. So even though you could stop you could stop more efficiently by just gliding to a stop or like hitting the brakes later, people actually are counting on seeing that car is slowing down to feel like they could go and cross all the way across before the other car is even coming. And so there are these things that we do that actually signal to people that they're seeing that we actually need the autonomous cars to also do if people are going to feel comfortable crossing in front of it. And that's the kind of thing that we can find out by using these different kinds of techniques. So I think one of the things I'm trying to pull out is that we have these different methods for trying to do the research to understand how people are going to interact with automation. And a lot of those methods involve simulation. So this is kind of a traditional driving simulator that I have in my lab at Cornell Tech. And we have an actual car, but it's surrounded by screens, and it lets us film what's going on, not normally with a film crew, but basically like look at what the human reaction is going to be to all these other things that might happen that we might design. We also do on-the-road driving simulations. So the Ghost Driver thing that you were seeing wasn't really an autonomous car, but there was a lot of computation and a recording equipment inside, so we could actually see how people around the car in the car behave. This is another thing I'm pretty proud of.
Does this feel like kind of okay?
This is VR in the car.
Yeah. Like, does it feel like I'm in a car?
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Can you put your hands out forward? Right.
Ooh.
And just leave them kind of center in your vision. And now you can just, like, if you drive straight, you should be going just...
Oh, this is fucking weird. I should probably not drop the F-bomb. Oh, God.
So you can see this car coming.
Oh, God.
It's actually
It was funny. Like, there was a car hitting them in VR.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, God. Yeah, we drove off the world.
Yeah, no.
Okay.
So that's from a pilot, but this is a research platform built by my PhD student David Gerticke, where we're staging a VR interaction, but we actually have it take place while a person is sitting in a car. So they have all the feeling, like the physics of the actual car movement, but you can make things happen in the virtual world that you wouldn't want to actually test in the physical world. So, I mean, this takes something like, just so you, like, if you have a in-room driving simulator and you put a motion base on it so you can simulate, actually, even the high-end systems simulate about a third of the forces you would feel in the real world, that's like $500,000 minimum, And then meanwhile, you can, like, almost anyone can get a car. VR headsets are very affordable now, and you can make it so you can actually simulate these kinds of feelings, like just in a parking lot. So this is the sort of thing that we're doing to understand how people are going to interact with automation. So I'm going to talk to you specifically about thinking about interaction with automation being a cross-cultural problem. Normally when people think about cross-cultural design problems, they think about stuff like this, like how something like a brand translates to different cultures. This is Coca-Cola in English and in Hebrew. And then there are these classic stories, like, for example, about the Chevy Nova, like the old-time story that we used to be told is like the people who branded the Chevy Nova called it Nova, and it sold terribly in Latin America because Nova means don't go. Turns out it sold great in Latin America, and that name doesn't, it's, so this is just apocryphal. But the focus is on cross-culture differences is largely focused on branding. But now that we actually have objects that have, behaviors, we actually have different kinds of problems. And I like to pick on Uber. Rafi Kekorkian, who is someone that Joe Fish and I both know. Oh God, it's so funny. This is going to be on YouTube. He'll see this. He is actually quoted in the article for Wired. He said, if we could drive autonomous cars in Pittsburgh, we can drive anywhere. And this is just it speaks to this idea that people who are working on autonomous cars are mostly thinking about road conditions and weather. They're just not thinking about everything else that's on the road. This is driving in Ireland. This is driving in India. This is driving in Israel. And so one of the things that we have to think about is when we think about driving, we all, people worldwide, can jump to some image of what it is, but it's not actually the same image. And the people who are programming cars also have this kind of feeling that driving is one thing and they know what it is and they can actually program cars to do it. But actually that causes problems. This is from a Wired article, and it's entitled, Why People Keep Rear-Ending Self-Driving Cars. And it basically points out from accident reports something that I think people who live in Mountain View might just know, which is that the Waymo cars that are being tested in the public road are constantly driving in some way that's very unlike normal cars. They drive very slowly, they're very slow to react to stop signs and green lights. And as a result, people who are driving around these cars often accidentally run into those cars. And the thing that they don't publicize, they always tell people that these cars get in many fewer accidents than normal drivers. But what they actually say is they get in fewer at-fault accidents. And every one of these rear-end accidents is not an at-fault accident, because in California and most places that you would drive, the car in front is not responsible what the car behind does. So if I ran into you, I would feel guilty and I would feel at fault. But if I found out the person in front of me actually got into 10 times the number of rear-ending accidents than normal people, I would start to wonder. And that is the case for these autonomous cars. The way that they're driving is so unusual, they're actually eliciting problems. And so, what these California crash reports make clear is that people expect the autonomous cars to drive like other people. They expect that kind of adaptation, but interestingly, the people who design the autonomous cars feel but we don't want to break the law. And it's funny because they're kind of threading the needle very finely. There are plenty of ways that we drive that don't break the law, but adapt to normal culture. But the people who are designing automation have their own idea of what driving should be, and they're just putting it out there without regards to how people around them will respond. And then I think some people respond pretty violently. So this is an article from the New York Times saying, wielding rocks and knives, Arizonans attack self-driving cars. And from the outside, from far away, if you've had no encounter with self-driving cars, you must think that this is these are the Luddites, these are the people who are worried for their jobs, but there's not actually that many people worried for their jobs. What there are a lot of people who are really pissed off when the car in front of them won't move at the stop sign. And so, this is the way that people respond when there's a really strong cultural difference and they don't want to change their culture. So I think it is really important for people who design technology to be aware of those normal cultures that we're introducing the technologies to and thinking about ways that we can learn what those things are and adapt. So bringing those things together, this kind of idea, this problem that we can see in cross-cultural differences with automation and this method that we use for novel simulations for future interaction, we really want to think about how we're going to use novel simulations to illuminate present-day differences in culture. And we can actually use every single different culture, where there's, for example, driving, as a laboratory for different ways that we might want to interact with the future. Maybe we'll all drive more like people in Paris. Maybe we'll all drive more like people in India. But even understanding what those differences are can help us understand the range of what could be in the ways that we interact at these more emergent situations. So we've done a few things that are just beginning. This is kind of a new direction for us. One of the early studies that we've done in this area was done in collaboration with researchers from Kyoto University. I'm going to show a video of this study where we showed drivers in the US and Tokyo driving scenes in the US and Tokyo, and we tracked their eyes. this is the Tokyo scene. So none of these people were actually controlling the drive. The drive was just like a set video. We tried to pick scenes that were really, really analogous between this scene that's actually in Osaka and then in San Francisco. And one of the really interesting cross-cultural studies that's been done already, kind of just in general, is work done by Richard Nesbitt. He has a book called Geography of Thought, which talks about the way that people think differently from different geographical cultures. And while there's been some criticism of this work, some of the most important research that's been noticed is things like people from Eastern cultures, when they're looking at a fish tank and they're asked to describe the fish tank, will start with fish in it. They'll start by describing the fish tank, how big it is, what the water's like, and then they'll get around to describing the fish. And people in Western cultures start to describe that same fish tank by describing the biggest, brightest, fastest fish, and then kind of moving out. So just this focus on foreground versus context, salience is measured differently in these different cultures. And maybe the most interesting work to me is that you can actually get people who are bicultural to you can prime them to describe things one way in one language and the other way in the other language. So interestingly, in the work that we were doing, we had differences in the participants from Japan versus the participants from the US, and it's kind of the opposite of what you expect based on what Nesbitt had found. We actually found that the Japanese participants were more likely to answer correctly questions about salient foreground objects that they saw during the drives, and they tended to fixate longer and more times on those salient foreground objects. Whereas the US participants were more likely to look at prominent background objects, like things that were on the side, stuff that you wouldn't look at if you were the driver, but that you might look at if you were the passenger. And the US participants tended to fixate longer and more times on those background objects. So, that's an interesting thing just to know. And those things might be not literally cognitive, it could be cultural. You could feel more comfortable, in a fake automated driving scenario and feel more comfortable looking around. It could be, that people who their opinion of what's important is different, but it's interesting to know that those differences exist. We're also doing looking at differences, for example, in the pedestrian automated vehicle interaction. I showed you earlier the research that we had with Ghost Driver, which took place at the Stanford campus. And one thing that we were asked a lot was, how much do you think it matters you did this research at the Stanford campus? And of course, it matters a lot. I remember at one point someone said, I was crossing the road and I thought I was a bad driver, but I saw it was an autonomous car. I did a good job. And so there's this enthusiasm, and understanding and willingness to kind of give way to technology in the Bay Area that's not shared the world around. So this is a version of this same study, but performed in the Netherlands.
Crosswalk beside a parking lot. Each trail consisted of a pedestrian and the car arriving at the intersection. Location 2 was an uncontrolled crossing inside a parking lot. We repeated our experiments using a normal car with a human driver in both locations.
Netherlands?
5 researchers acted as support crew and interviewers during all trials. Experimental protocols and methods were approved by the IRBs of both universities.
So it's hard to kind of quantify those differences between the study that occurred in the Netherlands and at Stanford, but in general, one thing that was really interesting is in the post-interview, when we chase people down and interview them, people in the Netherlands were more likely to express surprise about policy and the fact there is an autonomous car. They would say, I thought that those things were not allowed to be tested on the road, and I'm really surprised that there would be an autonomous car anywhere in the country if we didn't have a town hall meeting to talk about it. So if you come from the Bay Area, that's a really shocking sentiment. And that we've also done this study in Mexico, and in Mexico and in the Bay Area, more neoliberal states, people tend to feel things are happening all around us and we're being experimented all the time, and companies do things and we just experience them. Whereas in the Netherlands, they felt very strongly that they would have had a say in that. In the Netherlands, people were less likely to feel like they should finish the interaction and then stop and take pictures and reflect. They would literally stand in the middle of the road and start, videotaping things. So there's a little bit less the sense that it was really important to finish the interaction smoothly and then wonder how that happened later. And so there's some interesting differences, and those things are important to know. And thinking about methods that are lightweight and inexpensive to try lots of places then is important. So to that end, I'm going to point out this last thing that we're working on, and this is all in pilot. So it's stuff that we have just started running now, and we're planning to do a lot more. This is my PhD student, David Goedeke, someone who is a visiting researcher in my lab, and we are using VR helmets with a driving simulator, but this time in a lab, not in a car. But it's a two-person simulation, so two drivers are in the same virtual world, but not in the same virtual car. They're each driving their own car. And now we're setting up experiments to understand how those drivers are going to interact with one another. So it looks something like this.
Mother, so still dying. Sorry.
So one thing is that the VR helmets that we're wearing, we actually also have sensors in the front that allow us to model where the hands are. And when you're in the simulation, you can actually see your hands. You can see when your hands touch the steering wheel, and we have a gaming steering wheel that people can use to control the driving. And so if you move your hands around, it can be seen. And in fact, David has set it up so that you can also see when you encounter the other car, if that other driver, for example, flipped you a bird, you would actually get to see that modeled in the other world. And the thing that's nice about this is very portable, and it makes it easy to get people from different cultures to be driving the same virtual world. So we can set up things that are actually similar enough that we can compare the results. Because if you actually set up an experiment, like we know from the Japan studies, it's actually really hard to find a set of roads, and conditions that happen that are actually analogous in actual different places. So we can actually, in the virtual world, more easily control and give people who are in the US and in Israel, which is where this other study happened, or in Japan, the same environment, maybe with just a switch of the side of the car. So here is video from the pilot. This is actually taking place at the Technion in Israel. And we have two people, again, in the same virtual world in their own cars. And you'll see what happens when they come up on an intersection together. This is research I'm doing with Professor Avi Parouche at the Technion. So what we're seeing on the screen is actually what the woman on the right is looking at in her virtual glasses. And now they're coming up on an intersection, and this is both women seeing each other. This kind of thing with the explicit gesturing happened very rarely, but we just like it because it's so good at showing what's going on. And then after they cross through the intersection, they're asked to fill out a survey that asks how that interaction went, whether the other person did the right thing, if it was smooth. So this is something that we're just setting up now. One of the things that we think is really good about it is that we can actually record what all the simulated cars are doing in X, Y, and T, and particularly look at what sorts of things people are doing with the movement of the car to signal to each other who's going to take lead and who's going to go in merged situations, who's going to speed up and who's not. And if you have ever rented a car in a place that you're not from and tried to drive, you know that these are kind of the moments when you're just like, what's going on here? How do things work? So being able to quantify exactly what is different in these different places, what the headway distance is, how much time people use to execute maneuvers. These are things that we all know to happen but don't actually have data on. But it actually is super simple X, Y, and T information. So the goal here now is to try to profile these differences in behavior interaction and begin to design machines that fit in culturally. One thing that we like to do after we profile how people drive around each other is to do things with more drivers and then put virtual cars in there that match and mismatch the local driving style and see how people tolerate that in different places. And since this isn't this is a really new area for us, and I think for the field in general, if you guys have any feedback on that, particularly as a company that does a lot of field experiments, but in the online space between different sites, like we would love to hear about that. All right, and with that, I'm going to wrap things up. I will just self-interestedly mention I have this book, The Design of Implicit Interactions, which was published in 2015, but is getting much more popular right now for reasons I don't know. Thanks. Questions?
So the first question that we have is from Felix Lawrence. I have no bloody clue where he is. No idea.
Great.
I think he might be in this time zone, possibly. I don't know. It's hard to tell. And his question was, do people interact with robots/autonomous cars in a similar way to how they interact with puppets? And I asked him a little bit more about what he meant by that. And he said, when he was talking about how people were anthropomorphizing the trash robot and ascribing motivations to it, it seemed to me like they were playing with a puppet, interacting with an inanimate object, while remotely interacting with the hidden person controlling it. Is there research into how people interact and play with puppets that might be relevant to how they interact and play with robots when there isn't a human holding the strings?
I mean, to my knowledge, I think there's actually more research on how people interact with inanimate objects and different kinds of robots than there is specifically with puppets, mostly because the people who are in the theater community don't publish as a general rule. But yeah, I mean, I think that there is, we think that basically it follows social conventions, but they're weird unwritten ones, and they're not necessarily exactly in line with how people interact with other people. So the observation that it's like puppets might be another example of a space where there are these weird social conventions that we tend to go to, but we haven't articulated what those all are. So a lot of our work is about eliciting those things and publishing them, and it's not a really common technique, although we'd like it to become more common. And so, I mean, I would love for someone to do that kind of research around puppets and to be able to compare.
Excuse me. So I live here in the Bay Area, which means I know people who have the very bizarre job of training autonomous vehicles actually on the road. In fact, one of my dear friends is somebody who now trains people to sit in autonomous cars all day. And within your narrative, and over looking at autonomous vehicle research as it's unfolded and gotten more complex over the last 5-7 years or so, there's more and more emphasis on people who are not the primary technology designers, but are sort of other stakeholders within that ecosystem. Melissa Sefkin bringing the pedestrian really strongly into that note as well. But I'm wondering if you can speak to how those people who are actually sitting in the robots and training them directly fit into this research and could potentially fit into the process of culturally training robots and autonomous vehicles.
Yeah, that's a great question. I didn't highlight it here, but some of the bread and butter of our work is kind of just simulation studies. So some people in this room have been in some of our simulator studies. We have something that looks like a car, feels like a car, in a room with screens, and we have them driving. So we have done some studies. Like one of my favorite studies was done by like the lead author is Brian Mock, and I think the paper title is like Taking the Wheel. But he looked at if you put people in situations where they never have to drive, but they can drive, what makes them feel like they should just jump in and start driving? And he actually experimented with different kind of modalities for that intervention, like whether you have to press the button and then take a control, or you can just like grab the steering wheel and take control. And one of the things that we found was like this weird condition that we didn't anticipate, which is that people wanted to be able to grab the wheel and take control, but just edit the driving, just provide input on the driving, but not actually take control. Like when the moment the light changed over and said you're not in autonomous driving mode, people would like let go. They're like, no. They wanted to stay in autonomous driving mode, but to be able to control the car. And so when we provided that mode, what a lot of people do is they would like edit the car's movement. Like they would want to be a little bit further over, in the lane. They would want to stop a little earlier. And so I think that kind of hints that that's what people really want. Like they want to be able to train the car. They want for the car to drive, but to have influence. And I joke about that in my book on the implicit interactions as what I call the other H model. So in autonomous driving, there's this idea of the H model, which is like the car is like a horse. And you can have like tight and loose reins, to control the horse. And I was saying like, well, I mean, there's this other model, which is like my husband. My husband's an autonomous driver. I trust him when he goes off and drives. I'm not actually worried about it. But when I'm in the car with him, I like to be able to have influence on his driving. Not because I don't trust him, but because I'm in the car, and that's part of my agency, and I can have the ability to see things. I feel like I can have a positive influence. So I think that the way that people want to interact with autonomous cars is like the way they interact with other drivers, that they want to be able to have input, they want to have their concerns acknowledged, and so thinking about the right ways to do that training or input is important. So I mean, my sense is that is something that even people who don't have that job will want to be able to do, and I think that's an important thing to figure out.
So I have a meta question to that, which what I like about the driverless vehicle study is that it implies that we're reading driving as a communicative act, right? That one of the things you do when you're driving, I mean, I'm thinking about this like how you teach your kids to interact with cars, right? And you're like, well, don't go until you've made eye contact with the driver, right? And I wonder, I mean, really it's about that notion that communication is safety, right? I mean, in terms of kids.
Right.
Did you find, within that framing of a communicative act, I'm particularly interested in these cross-cultural differences, which you and I have discussed for some while, and I have a long-running argument with particularly Chen Zhao, who's now running, she's at Alibaba, I think she's running the lab there. We were on that lake in Guangzhou that's featured on the 1 Kuai banknote, on the 1 yuan banknote. And she said, oh, look at that island over there. And I said, I'm sorry, I'm very Western. I can't see an island. All I can see is a whole bunch of trees that happen to be in the same location in the middle of this lake. And yet I don't make friends easy. The communicative acts that you are identifying, what I thought was really interesting about your study is that you actually studied this stuff as if it was science as opposed to anecdote. And it's interesting that you found the opposite answer than what is generally available in the cross-cultural literature. Does the framing as a communicative act influence that? Or do you think those two are sort of orthogonal and they are...
No. I think we maybe it's such a foregone conclusion, I never think to call it out. But we think of like a lot of the interaction with machines and with other people, particularly on the lower level, like the stuff that's more obvious, like the things we were doing before we were people, creatures to it. The main communication mode is motion, is action, sometimes literally touch, and force and shoving. And so unpacking like what people understand from that motion is really important. And the book about designing implicit interactions it focused a lot on nonverbal interaction because a lot of what we do at a low level to signal, for example, when you're about to talk or what you're about to do, like those things tend to be signaled more through motion as communication than through like explicit verbiage, and then people understand that stuff often so well we never think to call it out until a machine does it poorly. It's interesting, though, because I think there's the things that we tell ourselves and there's what we actually do, and sometimes there's some difference. So, for example, the literal making eye contact and crossing the road. We talk to so many people, if you interview them, that they swear that's what they do. They swear. But we have all of this video that shows that people are not doing that. What people are doing is they're profiling whether the car is likely to slow down. And they're actually trying to cross before or after the car. They are doing all sorts of things to avoid the interaction. So the interaction is actually more the breakdown case. The situation, what happens is that if people think they know what the car is going to do, they just act. And the moment when they're trying to make eye contact is when they're not sure what the car is going to do. So all the time people would start to cross, and like the first day that we ran the ghost driver experiment, we were very cautious, and we stopped people to interview them about the autonomous car that they interacted with, and they did not recall any car, let alone an autonomous car, because walking on the street is so automatic. They just don't think about it. It's like they're doing this stuff as a background process. So the second day, because we were really kind of forced into it, when people enter the crosswalk, we eased in a little bit and then we stopped. We didn't even ease into the crosswalk. We just moved forward a little bit and stopped. And then people look up, and then they make eye contact, and then a lot of times they feel fine, like, okay, it stopped, and then they go. but they're just not even making eye contact with anything. There's nothing to look at. So they're, not sure what's going on, but they just feel like they have to finish walking across and then turn around and decide what really happened there. So they're kind of handling everything very phenomenologically. They're thrown, they just act. Yeah. And so it's really fascinating to find out this thing that we all know that we do, we train our children to do, is actually not the thing we do. It's the thing that we do when things are not clear and when they are broken down and you're negotiating what the future action is. And I think other people who have studied in pedestrian driver interactions have acknowledged this to be true, but that's just not the common understanding. It's fascinating. And it's different places, like in places like college campuses or places where you have like herds of, or at parades, like people make a point of not making eye contact, and like basically making eye contact is ceding power, and so it is with the drivers and so it is with the pedestrians, and they negotiate this way.
Do we have other questions online or in the rooms? There was a nice little thread on the Slack channel about cultural adaptations to there being self-driving cars around the place. Mm-hmm. Like that thing in Mountain View that you never get behind the Waymo because it's going to it's going to accelerate really slowly. It'll never go through a yellow light. Like it's really irritating when you get stuck behind one.
So it's interesting that almost gets to an ethical issue. Like people will adapt, and sometimes the adaptations are acceptable or they aren't. So the people who have been interviewed, and who knows if those people are still in charge enough, they're setting policy, have said that the cars should act the way they act and everyone else should just adapt. As a person in the community around, like that's offensive, but it is the case that people will adapt. It's just not clear how they will feel about it or what the long-term cost of that will be. So, I think one of the things that I would really like to get into more and is challenging with the methods that we use is longitudinal studies to understand how things unfold over time. One of the other things that's also I haven't stated explicitly before, is a lot of the techniques that we're using, we're trying to understand how people are going to behave before you have to build the robot, before you have to build the system. So normally companies will say, like, why don't we build it and just put it out there and see what happens? But by the time you've built it, you've sunk a lot of cost into the way that you've built it, and you start to rationalize some decisions that you've made, even if they weren't good design decisions in the first place. Being able to have techniques that let you see how people are going to react and then make your decisions about how to design the machine before you have done any designing or sunk any cost is really important to making people design things right.
Do you see movements in that direction? I'm thinking about things like, I was delighted to see Lyft put out a whole bunch of their data publicly around their self-driving cars. And I think that idea of open data is something that we are increasingly warming up to at Mozilla, I think. Like, I'm a huge fan of it, and then we'll discuss this kind of thing. But are you seeing that being a trend that's happening more generally, or is it still this very siloed? Because one of the advantages about the patent system, for all of its deep flaws, is that it's ultimately democratic, right? Mm-hmm. The end result of patents is knowledge gets out in the world, and after some period of time, everyone in the world can use it. But we don't have that same thing with data. In these data-driven environments, like, it was great that Lyft did that, right? Is that something that is aberrant, or do you see that as a trend that's happening?
I think it's hard to know because it's such early days. Like, I would like that to be the norm. That means we have to be, and it's difficult to legislate that to force that to be the norm. But on the other hand, every single one of these places where they do an autonomous car deployment, there's a lot of negotiation about what kinds of risks are borne by the community, what they get in exchange. And one thing that I really think is important is that the companies be asking for the data just so they could regulate what's going on, but so that they could also, that they gain some benefit that allows oversight. And maybe they're not literally the ones that are visualizing or looking through the data, but it makes that possible. Yeah. So, I would like that to be the norm. I don't see how we can regulate that, but if there were, I would love that to be, regulated. But then I think one of the things that's going to be really important is making that data legible. Because I think, even the stuff that's publicized, it takes some really, a lot of reading and guessing to kind of make sense of what that's like. And you would like it to be as legible as these videos, like this is what happened in this case or that case, and thinking about how we can take the data and make sure that's always presented in a way that anyone can understand is really important.
Cool. All right, final call. All right, please join me in thanking Wendy for her talk. put that on the